Joining me now is the Grattan Institute's Energy and Climate Change Program Director, Tony Wood. Tony, thank you, especially today, for joining us to talk about this, because I want to know about the accuracy of these figures, because when you get a department to look at something like this, you only get out what you put in, right?
Look, that's the nature of economic modelling. I think the real truth here is that all economic models are wrong. Some of them are useful. Look, the truth here is that it's unknown. We do not know what these things are going to take to build at scale. They don't exist at scale. They're not commercially available. It's a bit like saying, look, you see something on a website that looks like a nice thing to buy, then you find out, well, we actually haven't made them yet. We're still in the development phase, and maybe in 10 years' time you'll be able to buy some. But if you need a couple of hundred of these things, then you might be in a very long queue. So it's just incredibly uncertain. And anyone who thinks they can predict these costs with any degree of accuracy is kidding themselves and everybody else.
Okay, including the department.
Well, the department has based its numbers on data that's available. That's all they can do.
Yeah.
They would have based upon numbers that were originally put together by CSIRO, and they are probably the most reputable source of these sort of costs. But the problem is that whoever does these work, they're basing it on theoretical numbers. There's only, I think, 2 of these plants in the world. They're both in development phase. And every time I hear numbers being talked about, they're going to cost more. The only advantage that you might have with these is if you literally did put them where the coal-fired power stations are today, remembering that the communities there might not like the bad news that says we're going to shut down coal and replace it with nuclear. But if you did, you would avoid a lot of the transmission costs we need to put in place for supporting renewables. And that's, of course, turning out to be a pretty hard thing, as Minister Bowen certainly has found out.
Yeah, right. So let's just stick on that for a moment. So to change our transmission lines is costing tens of billions of dollars, because the lines need to be changed from coal-fired to get basically solar and wind into the grid. Why don't the transmission lines need to be changed if it's nuclear?
Well, the idea here is that, again, this is a potential rather than a reality, is that I think the idea from the coalition is that they would put these modular nuclear reactors just where the coal-fired power stations are today, and the gas-fired power stations as well, I guess, and they would then use the existing transmission lines. Whereas even though we put a lot of wind and solar in already where the existing transmission lines have capacity, they were designed to send electricity out from large centralised power stations. And wind and solar are not like that. They're distributed all over the place. And that means you have to connect them with more transmission. We have a very high renewable system. More transmission between the states makes a lot of sense. And that's why we're having to build this extra transmission. And what generally tends to happen is that the cost of this transmission and the storage to balance a high renewables grid probably pretty well balances out a lot of the low cost benefits of wind and solar, but they also get emissions down. And we can be much more confident now than we have been for a while about what the cost of a renewables grid will look like. We've got really no idea what a small modular reactor nuclear grid will look like. The good news is the opposition is not suggesting we build the huge existing nuclear power stations, which are eye-wateringly expensive, and we already know that for sure.
Right, so of the numbers that we've seen reported today that have been obviously given to the papers by the department, by the minister, what do you make of what's been put in to get this particular number of around 400 billion? Is, the cost of solar and wind accurate and the replacement? I mean, it's pretty hard, isn't it? There's a lot of grey around these numbers.
Well, yeah, and that's the nature of putting together numbers that are going to take place over some years' time into the future. And often the numbers, particularly the things we don't know a lot about, not because they're unknowable, it's just no one's ever done this yet, in terms of the small modular reactors, is that they're still well into the future. And the longer they are into the future, the cheaper they can be made to look. But as soon as you start having to build it, that's when the costs go up. And that's what we found with the renewables. The renewables themselves, as we got used to building them, the cost has come down. But then the cost of connecting them and the cost of storage, particularly the cost of connecting them, has gone up dramatically. And that's where the plan A, which is the one we're following now, has got into trouble now. It's still the right plan. Of course, this is what we need to do, because if we do even think about small modular reactors to replace everything, by the time they get here, it'll be all over, because we now are on a pathway to reduce emissions much more quickly than anybody might have thought 10 or 20 years ago. Yeah. And if we wait around for nuclear to get to the point where they might, and probably not, be cost effective, then the game will be all finished. So we really can't do that anyway. On the basic economics, nuclear just doesn't add up in my view. What we should be doing is getting on with Plan A, keeping an eye on what's going on in the rest of the world, and if in 20 or 30 years' time it turns out the small modular reactors could play a role in our grid, then of course, let's buy them. But I'd be very, very doubtful about that, and I'm certainly very doubtful and absolutely doubtful that we shouldn't make that commitment today.
Yeah, okay. So, Tony, when it comes down to it, a lack of bipartisanship over the last 2 decades have got us to this point, really, where we're trying to catch up when it comes to renewables, which is making them more expensive. So is your view, and I don't wish to verbal you, that we just kind of need to stick to the plan now, get on with doing what we said we were going to do, and stick to that plan. But if, there are proven technologies, go with them. When hydrogen, nuclear, whatever it is viable in the future, then we can consider it. But don't get into it in experimental stage.
Look, I'll tell you, you're absolutely right. Look, right now, the good news here, by the way, is that both sides of politics, that we now have continuing bipartisan support to the end game. That is a big change from where it was even only 3 or 4 years ago, and that's great.
Well, kind of.
I think the opposition...
I mean, is that a little optimistic from you? Because we see, a bit of splintering in that sense. Yeah, a bit of splintering in that sense, and I don't think it's rock solid.
Yeah. Look, I think there's always going to be people who are nervous at the edges, and I think that there are people certainly within the coalition, within the Liberal Party, who would say, look, maybe we should back away. But that just doesn't line up with the reality. We know that the climate is changing. We've seen it in Australia, we've seen it in the Northern Hemisphere, and we'll probably see it again in Australia in one of the next 2 summers before the next election. So I think that reality is dawned on just about, not everyone, but just about everyone. The question now is how we get there, and I think it's still very unfortunate that we have to sort of have this partisan discussion around what's the best way to get there. It's not smooth. It never was going to be smooth and easy. Plan A is the right one for Australia. We have a very unusual opportunity in this country with our large renewable resource, but we also have a large country. And so connecting it all together, it was never going to be simple, but getting on and doing it is what the challenge needs to be. And distracting ourselves with something that isn't there now, may almost probably not be there in 20 years' time, maybe in 30 years' time, but who knows? That's not the way to go. Not on something which is essential, that is a reliable, affordable electricity grid at low emissions.
Tony Wood, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, LJ.